Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of El Niño Speaks, and I have Keith Preston back on the show. How are you this evening, Keith?
I'm very well. Good to be back on the program.
Well, it's been a while since we've last talked, but interesting things are kicking off in the political space. And naturally, let's talk about the whole ostensive Elon Musk Trump rift. What do you make of Musk's departure from the Trump administration?
Well, I think it was inevitable because when you get people with the kind of egos that those guys have together, it's pretty certain they're going to clash eventually. I think a problem with Musk is that he started viewing himself as basically a co-president along with Trump. And then when things didn't go his way, he lost it. But I'm not surprised at all that happened. In fact, in some ways, I'm surprised it took as long as it did. It seems like that these tech bro guys that have surrounded Trump essentially have a different agenda than what the MAGA people are about. Like I've heard Steve Bannon talking about this, where Steve Bannon is pretty hardcore in MAGA, but he's talking about how well that some of these guys like Musk really have their own separate agenda, and I think that a lot of them have come to view Trump or his movement as a vehicle that they can sort of ride, towards the goals of advancing themselves. And then I think that's largely what led to the clash between Trump and Musk. Musk seems to be a somewhat unstable person, based on everything I've ever heard about him. Even when you listen to the guy talk, he sounds like somebody that, doesn't have all his wires crossed. And he also supposedly abuses drugs fairly heavily. So, it's not surprising that a guy like that would end up flying off the handle as soon as he ran into some kind of frustration. I think some of the other people that are, from the tech world that have thrown in their lot with Trump are probably playing it a little closer to the vest. Peter Thiel, for example, I think that he's, has a more workable strategy as far as using Trump as a means of gaining influence, which I think is a net negative. But it seems like Elon is a particularly unstable person, so it's not surprising he would clash with Trump eventually.
Yes, that's a good point. And also Musk's focus on EVs and just electric cars in general and some of the space stuff. I feel that there's a class conflict there because, for starters, Teslas and EVs, the conservative demographics are just not really down with that. Like when I was in Austin living there, the primary consumer base that would be buying Teslas would be probably liberals there or people that are adjacent to that, not really conservatives. If anything, conservatives there would probably be buying a pickup truck or a boat, for example. But Musk, on the other hand, he also, if I am not mistaken, tends to come from a more conventional liberal background, but he's obviously anti-woke because of his situation with one of his sons, going trans and all that. But from the start, I saw that relationship to be doomed. But Thiel is interesting because he does have a more reactionary rightist background and a history of donating to the Republican Party certain conservative causes. And he has been on record saying some stuff that is pretty edgy on the right. But why do you, because you mentioned this, view him as a net negative?
Well, Peter Thiel is a net negative because of his association with Palantir and the way that Palantir is being used to expand the surveillance state. And I don't think that any of these tech bro guys that are, directly or indirectly backing Trump really have the same objectives as, say, rank and file Trump supporters. I think instead they see Trump as a vehicle for advancing this kind of neo-reactionary, dark enlightenment, Curtis Yarvin influenced ideology And essentially what they want to do is set themselves up as a modern version of monarchists or a kind of feudal technocracy, like techno-feudalism is a term that I've heard used. But I think the kind of system, the kind of political system, social system these guys want is something more like the Gulf states, where you have an elite of, in their systems, you have these sheiks and monarchs and all that, who are sort of this hereditary elite. And I think those guys want to be sort of a techno-feudal version of that. I think they don't want to be bothered with things like elections or having to be responsive to public opinion or partisan politics. They want to become a new aristocracy. And a lot of their ideology, this transhumanism that they're into, is very reminiscent of ideas that came out of the 18th and 19th century of scientism and human perfectibility. Some of them are into this weird stuff, like they think when they die they're going to transfer their consciousness to robots and they're going to become immortal and live forever as robots or something like that, containing their consciousness. I mean, they're into really strange stuff. And none of that has anything to do with America First or conservatism, populism or nationalism or the perspectives of more conventional people that tend to back Trump or vote back the Republican Party. It's more like these fellows are just using all of that as a means of advancing these other interests that have nothing to do with the goals of the MAGA movement or the populist right or anything like that.
What explains the rise of Peter Thiel in Trump's second term as opposed to his first term? Was like the first term just a kind of like type of scouting endeavor or like a reconnaissance endeavor for Thiel to see how Trump moves and everything, and then he just waited for his second term to kick off to like start seeking his fangs into the Trump administration? Or what's the play with like Thiel?
Well, Thiel started off as sort of like a libertarian anarcho-capitalist type, and he was initially funding projects like seasteading. Like there's this project of where some people, usually some libertarian and crypto bro type people, want to start independent countries on the seas, basically, creating artificial islands that are going to be separate nations on the ocean. And they've also got ideas about doing that in Antarctica and Greenland, and subterranean colonies and space colonies eventually. And then they fuse that with this neo-reactionary ideology. Like Thiel himself is a true believer in the Yarvinite ideology. He's actually, says that he doesn't believe in democracy or republicanism. He's advocates a type of corporate monarchy or whatever it would be called. And I think initially, he was trying to just buy influence in the Republican Party. I think he saw Trump as his main chance, as somebody he could align himself with and advance himself politically. And along the way, I think he persuaded some of the other tech oligarchs or tech bros to come along with him, like at Musk, at least temporarily, and also Mark Andreessen, and and even a lot of people who were previously aligned with the Democrats, like Mark Zuckerberg. Even some of these people have, at least on a lukewarm basis, started to move towards Trump. I mean, all you have to do is look at who the people were that accompanied Trump on his recent trip to Saudi Arabia and Qatar. If you look at who was there, it was like a representation of ruling class interests. You had Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock, and you had some of these other tech oligarchs and people like that, as well as other financial oligarchs. And it seems like now that's really become the power behind the Trump presidency or the Trump movement. It's like these people have swept in and sort of taken it over. Like it may have started out as more of a populist right movement, but now it's been something that's absorbed by financial oligarchs and tech oligarchs. And I think Thiel and others like him simply see this as a vehicle. It's something they think they can use, and then discard the parts of it they don't want once they get enough power. The same thing was going on a few years ago with a lot of the woke DEI, ESG, BLM, LGBTQ, all that whole configuration. A few years back, you had BlackRock promoting all of that kind of stuff fairly aggressively. You had institutions like Bank of America and even Amazon, putting up BLM banners on their websites back in 2020. And now, 5 years later, a lot of those same interests have shifted over to Trump, so it shows that they will just try to use whatever vehicle they think is available at the time to advance their own objectives, and that they don't really take any of it seriously. It's almost like they're trying to co-opt all of these things and run them into the ground. It's like they co-opted the woke, PC left and made it look stupid, and now it's sort of fallen out of favor. The same thing with even the Ukraine war. It's like a lot of these sectors were initially backing the Ukraine war. Now a lot of them seem to pull back, but it seems like a way to discredit liberal internationalism, or maybe weaken the European position, because some of them are starting to pivot towards the BRICS. And now they're doing the same thing with populism and conservatism and nationalism.
Another point you called attention to that has been the talk of the town over the last week is Palantir. What is Palantir, and why should people be worried about it?
Well, it's a company, and the gist of it is that Palantir is a company of which Peter Thiel has, I don't know if he has controlling interest or primary interest, but it's a Peter Thiel related company that is it develops the technology that's going to be used for mass surveillance, and it's also about data mining and stuff like that. This all of the stuff that conspiracy theorists and others have talked about for years about surveillance and data mining and all of these kinds of things. This is it. It's here. Palantir is it. They have the technology to implement all of those kinds of things, and so this material is going to this technology is going to be used to create a massive system of surveillance. And interestingly, I've heard people, there are some people who've talked about this kind of thing in the past, but now they've defected to the Trump camp, like Alex Jones. So now they're trying to downplay it. Like I heard Alex Jones talk about, all of the surveillance capabilities, they're just going to use that to track illegal aliens. They're going to use artificial intelligence for immigration enforcement, or things that people on the populist right will tend to have a favorable view of. But it's actually something far more, much further reaching than that. I mean, this is something that's basically going to give the government ability to have everyone's information, in a centralized database that can be used for all kinds of surveillance purposes, as well as other punitive purposes. An analogy may be made to the social credit system in China that's somewhat well known. It's gotten a lot of negative publicity in some circles. That's largely what it seems like is on the way in the United States and perhaps in the general West, and something similar to the Chinese social credit system, or at least something that has that kind of surveillance capability.
And also, from what I've gathered reading about Palantir, there seems to be a Israeli Zionist connection. How does the Thiel network and the ventures adjacent to it connect with Israel?
Well, that's extremely important, because Israel is where a lot of this technology is developed. In fact, I've even heard pro-Israel people say, "Hey, well, Israel is on the cutting edge in the development of technological development," and they are. One of the things that they specialize in is the development of surveillance technology and data mining and espionage, spyware, and that kind of stuff. And they've been using it for the purpose of surveilling and repressing the Palestinians for quite a while. And a lot of this stuff is now being exported to the West, and a lot of these companies like Palantir are getting a hold of it, and they're developing this for similar surveillance systems in the United States. So Israel is right in the middle of all of this. Thiel is very Israeli connected. Thiel is one of the primary backers of what's called national conservatism, and national conservatism is an intellectual movement that's led by a guy named Yoram Hazani. And Hazani is a former protege of Irving Kristol, who was one of the founders of the neocon movement. And if you ever read over the program roster of a national conservatism gathering, one of the first things you'll notice is that it's all pro-Israel people, and how something to do with supporting Israel is always a prominent feature of the program. And I think the purpose of national conservatism is that it's a neocon front project to ensure that the right, the nationalist right or the populist right, stays under the Zionist umbrella. And that's why you hear so much rhetoric nowadays about the woke right. You hear a lot of the more neocon adjacent sectors of the right talking about, oh, there's this woke right. You've got people like James Lindsay and all of that who are always bashing the woke right. Well, by the woke right, what they really mean is the non-Zionist right. Or at least the sectors of the right that are outside the Zionist umbrella. And Peter Thiel is a primary financial backer of national conservatism and some of these tendencies.
Oh, interesting.
Now, yeah. And J.D. Vance, the vice president, he is a Peter Thiel protege as well. He's a former employee of Peter Thiel. I mean, it's really through Peter Thiel that J.D. Vance has been advanced professionally on the level that he has. So he's, I tend to view J.D. as sort of like the Palantir or Thiel or tech bro point man in the Trump administration.
That's my suspicion as well, that he has been, Vance in this case, has been designed in a Thiel-funded laboratory to be this type of stalking horse for these interests, because before if I am not mistaken, he was a never Trumper.
He was.
This guy, but this guy, he got that whole documentary, the whole Hillbilly Elegy book, and that documentary as well, on I think on Netflix. And this guy is just really astroturf. There's nothing really organic about Thiel's rise. In fact, it is not an exaggeration to say that without Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance would be a molecular speck when it comes to politics in the United States.
Oh, yeah, that's completely true. I mean, J.D. was an employee of Peter Thiel at one point. And Vance has also lied about, or at least misrepresented his background quite a bit. Like, he makes it sound like he grew up in some, dirt poor trailer park. And that's not true. He was raised by his grandparents in a suburb outside Cincinnati. Now his mother was a drug addict, so he does have, trouble in his family history. But his background was not nearly as deprived or as he makes it out to be. He misrepresents a lot of that. And he's a Yale graduate. He's not somebody from the country or something like that. And initially, he was a student of Amy Chua, who's a very prominent law professor at Yale. And then he was an employee of Peter Thiel. And then Peter Thiel is the one who's advanced J.D. Vance professionally. And it's through all of that Vance got to be a senator and then vice president. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. I mean, without Peter Thiel, J.D. would be nobody.
Also, with respect to national conservatism, in what ways is Thiel connected to that movement? Is he a donor, board member? What's the type of relationship he has with that crowd?
I know he's a major funder of that. What formal titles he holds, I'm not sure. Yoram Hazani, who heads up a group called the Edmund Burke Institute, he is the intellectual leader of national conservatism. And
yes,
by his own admission, he's a former protege of the Kristol family. As another thing, Hazani mentioned to an acquaintance of mine who's a well-known intellectual on the right. A lot of your audience would have heard of him. He admitted to him that national conservatism is a neocon front project, that it's funded by neocon money.
Oh, wow. I think I may know who you're talking about too.
Yeah, you probably do.
Yeah. This stuff is really intriguing because my interpretation of national conservatism and some of these adjacent movements like the Claremont Institute, it seems that they've done this really, really insidious type of if you will, where they have effectively put on like a Buchananite aesthetic when it comes to talking about foreign policy, but it's like Zionized paleoconservatism. That's
Exactly.
it's like the Israel exception.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. It's an effort to take paleoconservatism, the populist right, libertarianism, all of these kinds of movements on the right that generally have a more non-interventionist foreign policy outlook, and co-opt them and make sure they stay under the Zionist umbrella. That's exactly their function.
What do you make of the emergence of all these other groups like Passage, Press, and some of like these people on the post left, like the Red Scare girls, starting to pact more with the Teal Network? What do you think that's all about?
Well, I think that there seems to be a convergence going on of between the Silicon Valley right and some of the more, some people have called it post left, or sectors of the more countercultural left that are common in somewhat affluent circles, but have a lot of heterodox views on a lot of things. Like one example is the Robert F. Kennedy phenomena. Bobby Kennedy, I mean, he comes obviously from a very elite, prominent family, and he had the backing of a lot of these Silicon Valley weirdos in his campaign. Like, his running mate was Nicole Shanahan, and that's Sergey Brin's ex-wife. And I think she was the girlfriend of Musk at one point, or at least they had an affair or something. I think that's what led to her divorce from Sergey Brin. But she was, she's a billionaire because of her connection to those circles. And then she was his running mate and funding Kennedy's campaign. And now she's saying that she wants to start her own party. And this is going to be basically a Silicon Valley counterculture, project, it looks like. These are people that are really into all the stuff that Kennedy's into, like the anti-vaxxer, alternative medicine, all the like health related, kind of odd, naturopathy and all that kind of stuff. And that kind of stuff has always been popular among sectors of the left, usually the more countercultural left, a lot of hippie-ish types. And it was also big in the Bay Area, the West Coast tech scene, and it still is. And it seems like now that's starting to merge with MAGA. And you've got guys like Kennedy with this Make America Healthy Again. There was actually an article about that in the New York Review of Books that came out yesterday or 2 days ago, something like that, where they're talking about how a lot of these kind of countercultural left tendencies and then some of these kind of Christian conservative undercurrents are kind of blending together now, with things like opposition to vaccinations and that kind of stuff being a common thread. So yeah, there does seem to be a convergence there.
I also, when you look at this from afar, because given my historical background, I like to look at these things from a bird's eye view and try to look at common patterns. Do you think that the events of October 7th mirror the experience a lot of people on the left and certain elements of the liberal left faced during the late 1960s after the 6 Days War of 1967, where you saw a rise of a Black nationalist movement that was pro-Palestinian, and as a result, this prompted numerous intellectuals, leftists, and even some liberals of Jewish extraction to go more towards the right, or at least the center, moving away from the left and away from the Democratic Party in general. Do you see some parallels of that happening now as well?
Oh, absolutely. As to embellish on that a bit, the backstory you're describing is how we got the neocons in the first place.
Yes.
The way that the neocon movement, the neoconservative movement, emerged is that in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly after the 67 war, the 6 Day War, between Israel and the Arab nations, and then the subsequent Yom Kippur War in 73, there were a lot of Jewish leftists in the United States who came to the view that they needed to move to the right and be pro-American power if they weren't already. A lot of them were already left-wing Cold Warriors. A lot of them opposed the Soviet Union on anti-Stalinist, more like social democratic or Trotskyite grounds. And then they became increasingly opposed to the new left because they thought that the new left was anti-American and they wanted to use American power to oppose the Soviet Union. But more than that, a lot of the new left became pro-Palestinian or pro-Arabist, and they certainly wanted to use American power on behalf of Israel. So that's really how we got the neocon movement. The neocon movement emerged out of the fairly far left among intellectuals who realized that it was in the interest of Zionism to support American imperialism. That's really how Irving Kristol, Norman Podhoretz, all of the Midge Decter, all of these founding fathers and mothers of neoconism. That's how they started neoconservatism. And in the 70s, the neocons started moving towards the hard right of the Republican Party on foreign policy because they started to find common cause with the super hawks that came out of the Goldwater movement. And that would be people with that perspective today would be somebody like John Bolton or Liz Cheney, and of course, father Dick Cheney came out of that kind of background. So you started to see this convergence of the neocons and the Republican super hawks. And then you also saw the evangelicals. You saw a rise of the evangelical movement in the 70s. Like some sociologists of religion call it the Fourth Great Awakening. And then that converged with the rise of Christian Zionism. You had the popularity of all of this pop culture Christian Zionism, like Hal Lindsey and writers like that. So you saw this three-way convergence of superhawks, neocons, and Christian Zionists. And that really became the Republican Party as it was probably starting in the Reagan era and then increasingly so over time. And that's how we got the neocons. And nowadays, something very similar has happened because after October 7th, we saw a lot of the Zionist elite in the United States, including Zionists that had supported the Democrats previously. You saw them move to the right because what they wanted to do was weaken and destroy the pro-Palestine movement. They started wanting to weaponize, conservatism, nationalism, populism, anti-wokeism, Christianity, all of this other anti-Islam, to weaponize all of that stuff on behalf of Israel, essentially, against the pro-Palestinian movement. And that's how you almost on cue, you start to see a lot of these influencers associated with the neocon orbit or the neocon adjacent orbit all of a sudden came out and started calling themselves cultural Christians and stuff like that. Like you had a lot of these new atheist figures started saying, well, I'm a cultural Christian, or you had, you started seeing them elevate figures like Jordan Peterson or like the guys that are on that trigonometry YouTube program, Ayan Hirsa Ali, who's always been adjacent to anti-Islamic neocon circles. All of a sudden, all these people are talking about how they're cultural Christians, and I see this as a very cynical ploy, where what they're trying to do is weaponize, conservatism against the Palestinians on behalf of Israel. As we know, Jews on average tend to be liberal politically compared to most people. But that's not always the case. The most rabid Zionists often side with the political right. And I think the main reason for that is not only do they want to use American or Western military power on behalf of Israel and against, say, Islamic countries or Arab countries or Palestinians, but I think culturally they understand that Western bourgeois Christians, particularly conservatives, on average, are probably more sympathetic to Israel and to the Jews generally than the far left is, or or sectors of the far right, or even or certainly more so than Muslims. So what I've noticed since October 7th is an effort by Zionist plutocrats, your Bill Ackman types, as well as all the neocon adjacent, influencers and media and that kind of thing, to lurch rightward in a way and to weaponize the anti-woke movement on behalf of Israel.
One thing I really appreciate about your analysis is your ability to look at like the sociological aspects of certain political coalitions and break down like the class interests and all of that. This new Republican Party, what does it look like now that it's becoming clear that like, Trump has his vice grip on the party and it is pretty much unchallenged? What does the party coalition look like, and how who do you think is going to succeed Trump once he's out of the picture?
Well, like everything else, the Republican Party and its adjacent support institutions are very much layered into hierarchies and sectors. At the ground level, you have the Republican Party base. Well, first you have, I guess, what we could call the shock troops, and these are the people who are the most gung-ho, most aggressively pro-Trump or pro-Republican Party people on the grassroots level. This would be the hardcore anti-immigration movement, the hardcore pro-life movement, the pro-Israel evangelicals, the hardcore social conservatives, all the people that we would expect to go out and stuff the ballot box for the Republican Party during that election. That's sort of their shock troops, because these are their most effective or most aggressive ground level activists. The actual base of the Republican Party continues to be what the Marxists call the petty bourgeoisie, and this is like small capital. These are interests that are primarily motivated by opposing business taxes and business regulation and that kind of thing. More medium-sized, small, medium-sized capitalism, regional capitalism, particularly in the Sun Belt. Also, the Sun Belt capital itself is still part of the Republican Party. That's stuff like the fossil fuel industry, armaments industries in the South and in the West. Agribusiness is another major Republican constituency. As far as voters, the Republicans have been effective at reaching out to the Rust Belt, like working class people in the Rust Belt that have been hit hard by the effects of neoliberalism and globalization. You have some crossover voters, that think the woke paradigm on the other side of the fence has gone a little too far, so they're swinging backward. You have so you have a lot of different ground level voting interests among the Republican constituencies. From roughly the 1950s up through maybe the George W. Bush era, the real owners of the Republican Party were the military-industrial complex. And that has created something of a conflict, because you have among this new wave of Republicans, Trump and his fans, we've seen a revival of a lot of Republican traditions that existed in the pre-Ronald Reagan era, or even in the pre-Cold War era. We've seen sort of a dust-off of the 1920s style conservatism, like Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover, and also maybe turn of the century conservatism, like William McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, Grover Cleveland. So we've seen a revival of this kind of old school, protectionist, isolationist, anti-immigration right that's sort of now having to share space in the Republican Party with the leftover Reaganites and neocons, your Mike Pence types and your Mike Huckabee types and all of that kind of stuff. And I think it's interesting because what I've noticed lately is that it seems to me that the Republican Party and the Trump administration have had to capitulate to the military-industrial complex, because we have this record high military budget of $1 trillion. And I think the purpose of that is to simply buy the loyalty of the military-industrial complex. I think that because initially Hegseth and Trump were talking about how they wanted to cut military spending, but I think along the way the administration and the party realized, no, to keep the military-industrial complex in their camp, we've got to essentially buy them off, and that means we have to appease them and give them the budgets they want. Now, these interests are not necessarily pro-war; they're just pro-making money by manufacturing and selling armaments, and they don't really care, I think, about foreign policy per se. They just care about making money through arms sales. But of course, that has foreign policy implications because Israel and Saudi Arabia and some other places are among the major export markets for these kinds of interests, which are in turn underwritten by U.S. taxpayers. But I also think that Trump, as you were saying, is the undisputed leader of the Republican Party, and there's something of a Trump cult, and Trump is sort of now like a, you could say he's like a L. Ron Hubbard or Joel Osteen type of figure. He's like a sort of a cult leader type figure to his hardcore fans. That doesn't mean everybody who voted for Trump is like that, but there is a smaller constituency that I think pretty much rests on every word Trump says and thinks he can do no wrong. But other than that, though, more importantly than Trump himself, I think, are some of the most elite interests that have now thrown in their weight behind Trump, including elements that were not supporting Trump before, back in 2016. We've talked about the tech bros. It's clear that the tech bros have lurched towards Trumpism, during the course of the last couple of years. I mean, Thiel was always there, but then we saw Musk come aboard, and then we saw Bezos and Zuckerberg come aboard, and Mark Andreessen and others. So Trump has a lot more support from the tech world than he does now, particularly the upper strata of the tech world. And like I said, these are not people who care about America or American interests. They have their own interests. They basically want to be a modern feudal aristocracy. And a lot of these people aren't even Americans. I mean, they're South Africans or Germans or something else. And then there's also the Zionist plutocrats that I was talking about. We've seen some of those lurch rightward. Now, some of them are always there, like the Adelsons. But then we've seen Bill Ackman and some of these other people lurch towards Trumpism, because they want to weaponize, conservatism and populism and nationalism and anti-woke and anti-leftism on behalf of Israel against the pro-Palestine movement. So we've seen that happen. And another tendency, and I think this may be the most important one, it seems like that there are overtly globalist financial elites that are now see Trump's movement and administration as a vehicle. For example, BlackRock, State Street, Vanguard, these institutions are they're interesting because from what I can tell, these institutions are certainly globalists. In no way could they be considered nationalist in the same way as, say, an economic nationalist, like a Pat Buchanan type of person. But what they favor seems to be a different type of globalism. It's not the neocon model or neoliberal model of globalism. Instead, they're in favor of a geopolitical globalism where you have the way to describe it would be geopolitical multipolarity, but financial unipolarity. Now that differs from the neocons because the neocons want to have geopolitical unipolarity is what they want the United States to be this world's sole major power and to be the de facto government of the world, through Pax Americana, perhaps through the UN if they're more multilateralist, perhaps without the UN if they're more unilateralist. But that's kind of the neocon vision. That's the Bill Kristol, Dick Cheney, John Bolton, type of vision. And that's why they hate Trump so much. They view him as throwing a wrench in that. But the financial oligarchs, like the BlackRock types, seem to realize that America is in a state of decline. Europe is in a state of decline. They see the BRICS rising. They see the global South rising. They see countries like Russia, China, India, Indonesia, and others rising. They want to be there to capitalize on that. And I think that they look at it like, the multipolarity is inevitable. So they see Trump as sort of a vehicle through which multipolarity can be, or the transition to multipolarity can be facilitated, even though we're still going to have financial unipolarity. Like the world seems to be moving back to a world order similar to the 19th century, where in the 19th century, you had competing poles of geopolitical power. You had the, 10 or 12 European colonial empires, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Turks. The United States was a rising regional continental power back then. So was Japan. But they still had a system of financial unipolarity under the City of London and the Rothschilds and those kind of entities. And that seems to be the kind of world we're moving towards now. We're moving towards geopolitical multipolarity, where countries like the United States, the European Union, Russia, China are going to have their own spheres of influence, but then BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and the IMF and the Bank of International Settlements and the sovereign wealth funds and all of these kind of entities are still going to be collectively an apparatus of financial globalization and economic unipolarity.
It's fascinating to see the parallels, the historical parallels start to surface, because you're kind of getting like a flashback to as you mentioned, the late 19th century, early 20th century type of geopolitical multipolarity. But then on the domestic front, you're getting a return to the 1970s. And this leads me to another point. Do you foresee the resurgence of leftist violence kicking off? Because you already saw the case of the 2 Israeli diplomats getting killed, and then that Molotov cocktail attack in Colorado. Are those harbingers of leftist insurrection behavior or terroristic behavior becoming the norm in the years to come as the Gaza campaign continues?
First of all, we're also retreating back to the 19th century domestically as well. If you look at just as the world order is starting to resemble the 19th century with, like I said, geopolitical multipolarity, but financial unipolarity, domestically, we're going back to the Gilded Age in the 19th century during the Second Industrial Revolution, and the kind of class divisions and economic dislocations and rapid social and cultural change that existed during that time as well. There's a lot of very significant parallels there. And it's also somewhat similar to the 70s in other ways, ways in which that now rhymes with the 70s. But to answer your question, I do think that there is going to be an increase in political violence in the United States in the future, from the left, certainly, but not just from the left, from other sources as well. And there's going to be a lot of things driving that. Obviously, the level of cultural and political polarization that we have, and the irreconcilable differences over so many topical issues and political questions. Because the United States has this global presence all over the world, and has a very interventionist foreign policy, that combined with the fact that increasingly we have a diverse population of immigrants from all over the world, that means that all of these international conflicts are going to come to the United States. And that's exactly what we've seen in recent times. We've seen the Israeli-Palestinian conflict come to the United States itself. There was the incident at the embassy, or not I think it wasn't. It was 2 embassy employees who were shot at an event. We saw the incident with the Molotov cocktail recently. We also saw an incident in Florida where a Jewish guy shot two actual Israeli tourists, thinking that they were Palestinians. There was 3 Palestinians that were shot, I think in Maine or New Hampshire or somewhere like that a while back. There was a case where some landlord killed a Palestinian child, and I think it was in Michigan or Wisconsin. So, all of that shows that these international conflicts are becoming a matter of domestic conflict as well. I think it's quite likely that we'll see an increase in violence of a political nature, and not just over Israel and Palestine, but we saw the Luigi Mangione, who assassinated the CEO of United Healthcare. That's very reminiscent of the 19th century. The 19th century, there was a wave of terrorism And it was carried out by radical groups who had this concept called the propaganda by the deed. And what that basically meant is you inspire people to revolt or have a revolution or something through assassinating some prominent official or bombing something. The president of the United States, William McKinley, was assassinated in that way. And there was another way. There were other dramatic assassinations like that in European countries during the same time, as well as bombings and that kind of stuff. And of course, we've seen incidents like that in recent years in the United States and elsewhere, and it's quite likely that it will increase. I would predict that that a wave of violence like that in the United States would probably look about like the Troubles era in the 70s in Northern Ireland, where you had a lot. The situation in Northern Ireland in the 70s wasn't really a traditional civil war where you had two actual organized armies and fighting each other in a traditional military campaign. You still had a formal state structure, and you still had civil society, and people still went to work and that kind of stuff every day. But you had a whole lot of violence and terrorism between rival terrorist factions and paramilitaries and stuff like that. And I could very easily, I'm not certain it will happen, but I think it's quite likely something like that will become more commonplace in the future.
I've heard the Gilded Age analogy numerous times, and it's natural because of just the overall elite capture that we see within the Trump administration. How does wealth inequality in the present stack up to the wealth inequality that marked the Gilded Age era of the late 19th century?
It's basically the same kind of situation. If you look at patterns of wealth distribution throughout American history, for example, you see that right now we're about where we were during the era before the Great Depression in the 1920s, and that was a situation that had developed over time, going back to the post-Civil War era, and we're there again, and that tends to have a very destabilizing effect on society as a whole, as well as on the economy as a whole. So we can look for that to be a major issue in the future. I think in the future, class-based politics of some kind is going to become far more commonplace or popular. We see that now on the left, like we see Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They're out there doing their anti-oligarchy tour. And I think that kind of thing will probably become more popular over time. I've seen surveys that show that AOC is now the most popular, or at least most widely recognized figure on the left or among the Democrats in the United States. So it's very likely that class-based politics will make a comeback, along with the social politics and divisions that exist over all these other issues.
Do you think that for now, the Trump America First movement has just been totally co-opted, and that populism in the Republican Party has just been shackled, and it won't be able to take off, so it will have to take off somewhere else? Or do you believe that another iteration could come up, but in a post-Trump era?
Well, I think it's certainly been severely co-opted. You were asking me before about who is likely to succeed Trump. And I think that's open for debate. I think the tech bros would probably like for someone like Vance, who would simply be their puppet, to be their successor. It's possible, though, that he wouldn't be particularly popular in an electoral sense, and they may think he's too risky there. They may try to pick someone like, say, Don Jr., or maybe they'll try to bring in Tucker Carlson, although I think the Zionist wing of the that they would have issues with that. Now, I think the tech bros and the financial oligarchs would probably be okay with having Tucker as a front man, as long as they could keep him under wraps, because the more hardcore Zionists would not, obviously. So that's a conflict. In fact, I do see it within these elite circles that have co-opted Trumpism and the Republican Party. I see the conflicts are going to emerge in those circles as well, because the financial oligarchs, the tech bros, and the Zionist plutocrats may be the three most powerful forces, but they all have divergent interest in various ways as well. So I could see them clashing with each other. But some people are talking about how they want to try to find a way to skirt the 22nd Amendment and have Trump run for president again. Like I know Steve Bannon has thrown that idea out, saying, well, we're working on a way of getting around the 22nd Amendment. Now, it's possible that could happen. I think one scenario I've seen others lay out is that Trump just says, well, I'm just going to run for president again. And he enters the Republican primaries and does really well in the Republican primaries. And then say it goes to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court says, well, we'll just say, we don't want to start a civil war by making it look like the Republicans can't have their favorite candidate. So we'll just say, well, it only applies to 2 consecutive terms, not terms overall. That's maybe one way around the law, around the 22nd Amendment, maybe. I don't know that that's going to happen. That's just a scenario some people have thrown out. But, it is going to be interesting to see, who succeeds Trump eventually. And I think that's probably going to be when a lot of these factions start turning on each other, the financial elite, the tech elite, the Zionist elite, the military industrial complex, the MAGA populist nationalist movement. All of those have different interests and different reasons for being part of the Republican Party or the Trump movement or the Trump administration or whatever. So they may all start to clash more heavily with each other. That could, in fact, create an opening for the left. One thing we have to remember is that if we look at past partisan cycles tend to run every 40 years in the United States. Like one party will be dominant for about 40 years, and then the other one will be dominant for about 40 years, and then they'll switch again. Based on past partisan cycles, we're right now in the middle of what should be a Democratic Party-dominated cycle. Like we could say the last Republican cycle was, say, the late 60s to the end of George W. Bush's second term, and that the current cycle, which should be a Democratic-dominated cycle, began with Obama's first term, which means it wouldn't expire until almost mid-century. Now, if the Trump administration, either implodes or if the Republican Party, tears itself apart with internal combativeness, or there's just overwhelming unpopularity due to, say, economic downturn or some other negative feature, it's possible that Trump could go down as being another Herbert Hoover, and then the left or the Democratic Party could make a big comeback. And I think if that happened, the Democratic Party that emerged from that would probably be the most left-wing Democratic Party the United States has ever had. It might end up with something like President AOC or something like that. So that, I don't know that it's going to happen, but that's a possibility. I think if the Republicans, implode internally or are not able to find an appropriate successor to Trump, that could happen.
That's all fascinating speculation and other scenarios to just think about, because we are in a time of political shifts and realignment. So we don't know how everything's going to play out once the smoke clears. But with you here, Keith, you bring some sobering analysis that I think is desperately needed in these times. But I think this is a good place to stop anyways. But before we leave, feel free to promote your work, because I see that you're becoming a lot busier on Substack these days.
Yeah, I'm the main editor of a website called attackthesystem.com, and that's been around for about 25 years. And there's news updates posted there every day. I'm also on Facebook. I'm on Twitter, or X as it's now called. I'm on Substack. My full name is Troy Keith Preston, and that's the name I use on Substack. And also, I've got about 6 books I've published in the past. You can find out how to order those from the website, Attack the System, or also through the publisher, which is Black House Publisher. And then Troy Southgate's publishing company, Black Front Publishing, that's actually going to be issuing a couple of books by myself in the future. In fact, I think one of them is now out, Philosophical Anarchism and the Death of Empire. And then there's another book I think it's going to be coming out soon, and perhaps a series of books. So, look all of that up because I've got a lot of material out there.
Perfect. Thank you again for coming on to the show, Keith. And to my audience, thank you for tuning in. And with that, El Nino has spoken.